Thank you both, Randall and Oswald, for your presentations. They were really fascinating. It was great to hear that juxtaposition of government and industry body approaches to working to simplify and digitise trade. I think for me the key takeaway was that there's a lot of complexity, but there's a lot to be gained from digitising and simplifying trade processes. And also that collaboration and cooperation is key so that we ensure all the relevant voices have a say in how these systems are being developed. And that goes to Randall's point about providing your contributions to the work of the STS task force. But yes, we'll be moving on next to the panel session, and I'd now like to introduce the moderator for the session, Patrick Jonassen. Patrick manages GS1's Asia Pacific Regional Government Affairs with a focus on cross-border trade processes, supply chain integrity, traceability and food safety. Patrick works closely with the private sector and a number of APEC governments to further the use of standards to facilitate trade. Patrick also regularly speaks and moderates at international conferences and meetings, including representing GS1 at the UN, FAO, WCO, World Bank and other international bodies. During his 15+ years in Asia, Patrick's been in Japan, Singapore, Indonesia and Malaysia, and in previous roles, he was representing business in the public-private dialogue with the governments of ASEAN. Welcome, Patrick, and I'd like to invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Thank you for the kind introduction. I will try to bring you through the panel discussion today. So to start off, I would like to introduce two panelists that will join our previous keynote speakers. So the panelists are Maria Rosaria Ceccarelli and Jessie Riddell. So Maria Rosaria has more than 23 years of experience in international trade within UNECE, where she is the chief of the trade facilitation section in the Economic Cooperation and Trade Division. Maria is responsible, among other, of the United Nations Center for Trade Facilitation and Electronic Business, or UNCFACT. She manages a group of some 1,300 experts working on trade facilitation and e-business projects to produce trade facilitation recommendations and e-business standards that can foster growth in international trade and related services. Under Maria's supervision, UNCFACT is working at the moment on more than 40 projects on trade facilitation and e-business across the value chain, including projects on traceability and new technologies, not limited to blockchain and IoT. In her former position in the UNECE Transport Division, where she has been working for 12 years, she's organized and delivered training to promote the development of border crossing and transport facilitation and provided advisory services on customs questions affecting transport. So welcome, Maria. Thank you so much for joining this session today, early morning for you, dialing in from Europe.
Thank you very much.
I would also like to introduce Jessie Riddell, a senior international partnership manager at Standards Australia. He's an experienced policy analyst with a demonstrated history of working on international trade matters. Jessie draws on many years of state and federal agency experience and is skilled in market access, trade negotiations, and standards and trade policy development and implementation. Prior to joining Standards Australia, Jessie was Senior Associate at the Trade Division of Investment, New South Wales. He's worked with the DICER as an acting manager and trade negotiator in the trade policy section at the AWE in trade policy, focusing on trade and market access in North Asia. Jessie and the international team at Standards Australia foster close relationships with other national standards bodies and regional and international standards organizations to build capacity and to promote economic integration in the region. Most recently, this has included leading DFAT initiatives focusing on digital trade standards capacity building, involving the Asia Pacific Study Center at RMIT and Access Partnership. Jessie, welcome to the panel. Thank you for joining as well. I would also like to invite again Oswald and Randall to this session. So just following up on the two presentations we've had from the keynote speakers, maybe Oswald, if you can take the first question. Today, there is an apparent convergence of trade facilitation and digital initiatives happening. What do you see as the biggest challenges getting everyone aligned on digital trade and digital trade standards? And also, Randall, if you can chime in after Oswald's comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patrick. I'll briefly mention two, but there's a lot. So the first is people love recreating things. So there's this view that all of the old ways of doing things weren't necessarily sufficient and we have to reinvent the wheel, whether it's on identity or whatever the case might be. And so I think the first one I would highlight is taking people on a journey to appreciate and understand a lot of the great work done by UN CFAC, GS1, etc., and that these are actually solutions to their problems that can help accelerate the journey to innovation as opposed to not. And the second and final one that I would mention, at least from my side, is that it's articulating the value. So actually helping organizations understand when they do capital allocation, why should the digitization of trade or supply chain processes rank in the top 10? And so how do we help businesses understand that as something that I would argue is a challenge, but not a massive one.
Yeah. Thanks, Oswald. Randall, any comments on that?
Yeah, I think alignment is critically important. As the CEO of the Digital Transformation Agency, which was my previous role, I had first-hand experience in the power of aligning people, particularly in terms of the COVID response. We achieved things that we could not have independently achieved, but the challenges that we experience in a period where there is not a crisis are no different to those that we see for alignment for trade. Getting everybody aligned inevitably tests existing control structures. You know, instead of thinking in terms of organisational accountabilities, you need to think in terms of shared accountabilities and the business outcomes. There are also challenges in relation to resourcing. Again, designing and building a shared or common capability requires us to think differently about how we apply people and money and where the sharing comes from. And then existing complexities in our regulation and systems are also challenges. I don't think we'll ever end up in a position where we replace everything. So that means that we'll need to think about how the new can coexist with the old and how we progressively transition without breaking things. I mentioned our baselining work, which is nearly complete. This is demonstrating to us the importance of this alignment. Regulations, we found 200 regulations that support cross-border trade. Many of these haven't been updated in a decade and they cross over or at worst duplicate one another. We found as part of our ICT system scoping study, 134 government ICT systems support cross-border trade. Again, many of these systems are very old, quite a number have passed their 20th anniversary, and there's high levels of duplication with, for example, 20 business-facing trade portals existing now. So this alignment is critically important. There is an important element that I will add in relation to the need to build or rebuild confidence, depending on your perspective in the cross-border trade reforms. We need to prove that we're up for this through delivery. Nothing that we can say is actually going to get the support that we need other than the power of delivery to gain confidence and support.
Thank you, Randall. Thank you, appreciate it. Maria, I move over to you. You've been working in the trade facilitation area for many years, and what are some of the most important developments you've witnessed, and how do digital trade standards developed by UNEC and UN CFAC and other organizations work together?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I would like first to introduce my organization. So you already mentioned UNEC and UN CFAC. So UNEC is one of the 5 regional commissions. And even if we cover the geographical area that is a kind of Europe, Central Asia, North America, our main body, that's the one that I manage, UN CFAC, the United Nations Center for Trade Facilitation and Electronic Business, is a global body. And in the UN system is the focal point to develop electronic business standard and trade facilitation policy recommendation. In the last 30 years, UN-CFACT has developed some 500 electronic business standards and 50 policy recommendations. And these are all available free of charge to support international trade and to foster a resilient and efficient international value chain. Our business standards and trade facilitation policy are developed by a community of some 1,300 experts that are coming from private and public sector and also international organizations from all over the world. To reply to your question, for sure, the most important development that I witnessed lately is the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the global trade habits. And this was already mentioned by several speakers before me. But this has been really striking. From one side, the pandemic has sunk the global economy into a deep recession, especially for developing countries, has disrupted the international supply chain. If you think that into 2020, the value of merchandise export fell by 80%, while services trade declined by 21%. But at the other side, I've never seen something so powerful in boosting the digitalization and the use of digital tools. At one point, the world realized that without electronic means, they were going to be confined in their houses. They were, ending up without goods. And this was really the most powerful boost that I've seen in all my career. Just to give you an example, just a little example, UN-CFACT, among other things, produce also agri-food and fishery standards. And before the pandemic, not many countries were sharing sanitary and phytosanitary certificates electronically. A lot of countries that were still using paper. And once the pandemic started, governments realized important to use e-certificate for SPS in order to be sure that perishable good stuff were not stuck at the border, while also enabling workers and traders to avoid physical contact. So in this, everybody was really running to try to speed up and get up to it. And even if UN-CFACT has created e-certificate a long time ago, everybody kind of panicked and was there kind of getting ready for it. And the standard is a cross-border trade standard, so it's very important to have this the goods passing the borders and arriving to the final destination. And then the second part of your question, how do digital trade standards developed by UN-CFACT and other work together? All our standards are interoperable and they use the same semantic, and we put a lot of effort in managing and updating our core component library. And this is because we know that it is very relevant for all our stakeholders, so that we can all be on the same page. And in addition, it is in the nature of the United Nations to put several actors around the table to be sure that the final result will benefit all our stakeholders, especially the most vulnerable. And just to mention one of our flagship works that is aimed to develop an international framework initiative to enhance transparency and traceability for sustainable value chain in the garment and footwear industry. We are at the moment cooperating with some 40 organizations, among which, of course, there is GS1.
Thank you so much, Maria. I'm just picking up on your comment on the SPS certificates going electronic. Of course, I followed this development during COVID. What do you think will happen now, kind of when we're in the post-COVID, hopefully, transition? Will governments go back to requiring hard copies again, or do you think they're more comfortable moving into e-certificates?
I think that there is no going back. That we are on a different way of working. Yeah. That is covering, of course, SPS, but also e-commerce and generally digitalization in the exchange of documents. And I really don't think there is we are going back. Just, you know, for example, ECIDES, you know, we are supporting the Convention for Endangered Species to develop an electronic certificate for endangered species. And if you think that the pangolin at the moment, at one point, was kind of accused to be, you know, the beginning of the pandemic, everybody's kind of got on their foot and started to run. So I don't think there is, we are going to go back. We can only go, you know, continue on this very good start.
Thank you, and I hope what you're saying is correct, and that governments will not start moving things backwards and going back to business as usual. Jesse, I want to turn over to you if you don't mind. What role are national standards bodies playing in this discussion? The role Standards Australia has, and also since you've been working a little bit in the region with your projects, what do you think the readiness among standards bodies in Southeast Asia, ASEAN states are to collaborate with you and with other standards bodies?
Thank you very much for those good questions, Patrick, and thanks also to GS1 for organising this great session. So on the first question, the role of national standards bodies is to support the development and adoption of internationally aligned voluntary standards that really set the guidelines for how a product or service should perform. So it's our view, or I guess our ambition, that voluntary standards should be built around international consensus so that they represent truly internationally recognised guidelines and frameworks, so that they can facilitate international economic activity, enhance competition and boost industry. This is certainly important in the context of digital trade and digital trade standards, where the increasingly complex systems and supply chains mean that industry need now more than ever internationally aligned standards that support them to navigate those complexities. So the voluntary standards that are set by the international standard setting bodies with the support of national standard setting bodies are really a great basis for those digital trade systems and the settings. So it's really the role of the national standards bodies to support the development and adoption of those internationally aligned standards that are the basis for those digital trade systems, to ensure that there's harmonisation and interoperability of data, and also in a couple of other key areas. So it's also important to establish cybersecurity standards that really support the security of any digital systems, and also the interoperability of cybersecurity methods as well. And in addition to that, it's important to establish internationally interoperable modernized payment, messaging and e-invoicing standards as well, to support uptake of emerging technologies particularly. So another key element to all of this is ensuring that these standards keep pace with new technologies and the fast-moving nature of digital trade. And that's where national standards bodies really need to ensure that standards are developed and adopted and then reviewed and updated regularly. So some of the key recent work in this space that's particularly relevant to the digital trade agenda, that's a focus in international standardization, is the work of ISO Technical Committee 46, Information and Documentation. That committee manages the codes, the country code standards and standards for data that really are those foundational standards for many online databases. And Australia is a participating member in that. And that technical committee is currently developing and updating a range of standards for new identification data standards, as well as updating some of the older ones that are now a bit outdated with changes in technology. So the importance of the national standards bodies is ensuring that they engage properly with stakeholders, businesses, to ensure that those standards are set in a way that does meet the needs of business. So another area that's particularly relevant is the work of the ISO Committee on Financial Services, that's looking at modernising the payments, messaging and e-invoicing standards through the development of standards that provide uniform systems. Again, Australia is a participating member in that committee and is really engaged in the work, including work to develop security standards for digital payment systems and information exchange standards. And finally, of course, there's the work that's going on in blockchain standard setting, which is really central to future establishment of modern digital trade systems. So Australia is leading that through developing the new international standards for blockchain, establishing and managing the technical committee that's working on that. And I guess to move on to the second part of the question in terms of the ASEAN region and their ability to align on digital trade, it's a great question, and it's really central to the success of international digital trade, that international interoperability across borders that will allow for the widespread uptake. So yeah, it's certainly something that's been a big focus of Standards Australia, supporting our regional partners to increase their capabilities and to promote, I guess, supply chain resilience. The digital divide is something that is very, very well reported, that less developed countries really, there's risks of inequality and inefficiencies caused by that divide in those countries. But what is less talked about is the capacity of countries to engage in international standards setting and adoption, and to use that as a basis for good regulatory practice. So within the ASEAN region, there are countries with different levels of capability when it comes to quality infrastructure, their standards and conformance institutions. And this impacts alignment on digital trade in the region, as the countries with less developed quality infrastructure are less able to participate in standards development for the standards that underpin digital trade, and are less capable of adopting those standards as well. So the impacts there is that it's less likely that any digital trade system established in those countries will meet international best practice or be harmonized with international practice. So that means that digital trade systems may not be easy. Well, business interests in the region may not be met as those systems aren't harmonized and based on interoperable data. So it might not be easy for business interests to, well, businesses to trade in the region. So in light of this issue, there are a range of efforts underway, as you mentioned, Patrick, to build capability within ASEAN of regulators and national standards bodies to encourage them to participate in international standards development. So Standards Australia are engaging regularly with ASEAN and work closely with our counterparts to increase the uptake of standards and to support digital trade standard setting participation in the international standards bodies. A recent activity was, well, an ongoing activity is the ASEAN Australia Digital Trade Standards Initiative, where we're currently in year 3 of a 5-year program to support ASEAN on digital trade, which the program supported by the Apex Study Centre and DFAT as well. And that's included a range of workshops and a range of meetings to determine the needs and the capabilities in each ASEAN country, and to support them really to align internationally on digital trade through participating in standard setting. And it's certainly something that won't be solved overnight. There's a range of different capability levels in that space, and it's certainly going to be an ongoing process to continue to support some of the ASEAN countries to be more engaged in international standard setting and adoption to really facilitate digital trade uptake in the region.
Thanks, Jesse. And I realized when I asked the question, ASEAN is such a big and diverse region where obviously Singapore is leading the way, but at the same time in the grouping you have these least developed countries that are really trying to just make the first moves towards digitization. So and we're also seeing this when we are engaging with both standards bodies and regulators in these least developed countries, that it becomes a very complex discussion sometimes because they don't have the capacity maybe within the government agencies. And it's really great to hear that you and Australian government are working to raise this. And I know there are other, for example, where I used to work previously from European Union, also many programs trying to raise the capacity in ASEAN. So it's a super important region for us to keep on the radar here, and thanks for the work you're doing there. Any other comments or points you want to bring up in this context of the discussion?
No more from me, Patrick.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead.
Patrick, maybe I have a question for you.
Okay.
Even though you are moderating, GS1 is just absolutely foundational to global trade on so many different levels, and very similar to ICC, you're also cross-regional, cross-industry. You get to see it all. You engage with a lot of stakeholders. How do we ensure, from a GS1, from your perspective, that we don't have duplication of work that's in the region? And what is GS1 actually doing, to help support the digitization of trade?
Yeah, thanks, Oswald, for asking me a question. I appreciate it. No, I think first of all, just to look at the GS1 ecosystem in the Asia Pacific region, what's always foundational for us is our members and our membership. So in the region, we have around 500,000 to 700,000 members. Obviously, our biggest market is China, but we have big memberships in countries like Korea, Japan, Australia, India, and others. And what we always try to do is make sure that we are best facilitating their business and kind of cutting cost out of their procedures and out of their supply chain. So this is something we've been doing for the past 45 or so years globally. So what's foundational for us, and what I always keep in mind when working on these types of topics, is that make sure we have the foundation, that we have industry support for what we do and industry alignment. So in every market where we are active, we are very closely aligned, both with the objectives of our key members, but also key industry groups in those countries. So for example, we're working very closely with Australia Food and Grocery Council. We're working closely in the region with the groupings like ASEAN Food and Beverage Alliance, Food and Industry Asia, and others, just to make sure that what we are propagating and proposing as GS1 is also what our industry members would be willing to get behind. So I think that's kind of foundational for the work that we are doing, and we've been digitizing supply chains for the last 40 years, helping to exchange electronic messages and information about goods being traded. So as Maria mentioned in the opening statement, this discussion feels like it's a continuation of work that GS1 has been involved with for the last 40 years, but previously it's been more on a country by country basis, and now we're seeing that there is really a need to take this to a regional level as well as a global level. So that's kind of the key aspect. And the other point that we haven't really mentioned today, but where we are very active, is engaging with e-commerce platforms, marketplaces, online retailers. So, I mean, this is a totally new space for GS1 as an organization, but we've learned to engage with these stakeholders, and today most of them, the bigger ones, Alibaba, Amazon, eBay, etc., are all using GS1 identification standards on their platforms, and we want to take this further also to help underpin, when those goods are transported across border, that we can also use GS1 identification standards for those supply chains, and help border agencies, for example, with the control processes of the small e-commerce parcels that are crossing borders millions of times per day. So our view here is that we're kind of building on the foundation that we already have as a standards organization, working closely with the industry, and now trying to take it a step further. And last point, sorry to ramble on here, but what's really foundational for us is to have good collaboration with ICC, with Food Industry Asia, with you and UNCFACT and others, to make sure that there is a clear alignment, there is no overlap, and that we all kind of support each other in the work we do, because in the end we want to move in the same direction and support business and support cross-border trade flows. So thanks, Oswald. Appreciate the question. If I can kind of close this out by throwing an open question at the panel, and just I'd appreciate if you all would jump in here. So today there appears to be a lot of momentum building, and I'm seeing it here on this panel, and I've felt it over the last 2 or 3 years. How well aligned are we all, and what can we do to accelerate the activity that we are currently driving separately and jointly in some cases? And how do we avoid duplication of effort and cost to industry? So maybe Randall, if you want to go first, and maybe this touches a little bit on your previous response, but maybe can you build on that a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I mean, we know that being aligned is critical. We can't afford to duplicate effort when resources are so scarce, and the urgency is so high. And we know from our interaction with businesses that it's extremely frustrating when our efforts aren't aligned. But with that said, to the point that I've made very early in my item, we have got answers to questions that we don't need to ask again. We're hearing very consistent messages from industry and government: simpler rules, more joined up or integrated services, higher levels of digitisation, and more data sharing using standards by default. And so where I think we need to ensure we remain aligned is in ensuring we understand the various programs and their intent, and contributing across the boundaries of associations and industry and government, so that we have an overall view, at least a high level, of the things that are going on and what we can expect. And then we can identify areas where we might work together, co-design, we can co-test, we can create proofs of concepts and pilots. This group can help to build awareness through its networks. And I think the communication and engagement is going to be critically important, such that we know what each other is doing, and then orienting that as we are to a business-focused view, not based on here is my contribution, but the orientation is what do importers and exporters experience, and what are we doing to prioritise the pain points and invest in their remediation.
Thank you, Randall. Maria, can I pose the same question to you?
Yes. Well, to avoid effort and cost to the industry, we need to focus on a global partnership. Also to attain the sustainable development goals through digitalization. And this is very important for the UN, and is where UNCFACT has a global mandate. At the level of international organization, we need to keep track of the work we do, and that is done by the different agencies to avoid duplication. And this is why we create cross-organizational issue-based coalitions. And in this way, we can update each other on the work that we do with regards to digitalization. And also a very important issue, and I saw before that there was a question on this in the chat, is to focus on capacity building activities. Capacity building activities can help private sector and governments by sharing knowledge and enabling to better implement the digital solutions that are available. And just on this, for example, one of my team just came back from one of our transition country, Kyrgyzstan, last week, where they've been discussing with the university, the government, and the private officials on how to better implement efficient, resilient, and sustainable trade facilitation policies and standards. And finally, following the capacity building activities and assessment study that we have implemented in the project.
Thanks, Maria. Jesse, can I pose the same question to you? Get your view?
Yeah, certainly. So Oswald already covered the different players in the digital trade ecosystem and the need for collaboration very well, and so did Randall and Maria in their comments. So I might comment on another sort of key focus issue when it comes to alignment, and that is alignment with industry and stakeholder priorities. I feel that if that is the key focus as it should be, then that alignment between work efforts sort of comes with that. So digital trade processes and the standards and mechanisms that facilitate digitization, like any standards, need to be industry driven to ensure that they meet the requirements of business. And this means bringing together the experts from industry, government, consumer groups and NGOs, and many of the people here today, to ensure that all voices are heard and the right people in the room in undertaking these efforts. Yeah, I think that's also really a key element to this.
Thanks, Jesse. Oswald, what's your take? And I'd especially like to hear your view on what we can do to accelerate the activity, because I watched you start up the ICC DSI last year in maybe September or so, and you've been like a Formula One driver leading this initiative, just rushing through, you know. And we're all looking forward to this weekend's final races in Abu Dhabi. But can you give your view on how do we accelerate things? Because you've been really good at it, I must say.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and thanks for everyone. I must say, when I was interviewing for this job, I actually was using a lot of Standards Australia's content that they produce. I just have to also say that, Jesse. So accelerate. It's a team sport, right? There's a lot of different roles with a lot of different people that can actually participate. I went through some of who's on the call. If you're from a consultancy, help us sell the value. You've helped organizations across the world deploy productivity and agile and collaboration projects, all of these different things. There's a next age of actually helping organizations super connect to each other with trusted, reliable data. So help us, you have a role to play. Go to organizations and sell the value of adopting these standards and becoming interoperable. If you're from the public sector, you know, there are digital trade agreements, for example, that as we can educate the business community to understand, for example, the digital economy agreement that Australia and Singapore has with each other, that there's already a trade agreement with infrastructure for us too, with MOUs around digital identity, e-invoicing, paperless trade, trade facilitation, data sovereignty, all of these elements are already there and you can actually use it today at no regret cost. So let's educate that business community that these things exist and they help solve real problems. Let's make sure, again, if we're in the public sector, there's a superpower that you have that the business community doesn't have. You can make it legal to transition off paper onto electronic. And let's learn from each other. ASEAN, Commonwealth, the UK, let's all work together, learn from each other, be humble. And so some of these foundational elements we should work together on. And finally, Patrick, to get off my monologue kind of stage, the last thing I'll say is in the business community, we all have a part to play. We have to build up the capabilities. We have to build up the new jobs that the next generation of people are going to go into. And a lot of those new jobs are at the back of us being able to digitize some of these foundational tools. The reason I get excited is not just because if we can digitize an EBL, we can reduce working capital. The reason I get excited is because of all the other innovations that all of us can't even dream of today that's going to follow once we actually remove a lot of those barriers from our businesses. And so, yeah, experiment, pilot, support the fintechs, support the standards organizations, and support government in helping to make this happen.
Thanks, Oswald. We have a question in the Q&A, so I'll read that. And I think Marcel from the GS1 Australia office is standing by to answer the question. So the question is, you speak about interoperability of data and messages. However, interoperability also entails interoperable business processes that align with data exchanges. Is there some place that industry can turn to for training and information on business process interoperability? Marcel, you want to take this one?
Hi, Patrick, and yes, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I don't know what happened in there, but I must have clicked the button by mistake and put myself forward inadvertently to answer the question. That's okay, but given that I'm here, I might as well at least provide, I guess, an answer from a GS1 perspective, and then perhaps Maria or Jesse might want to comment further. But certainly, in the standards world, you've got standards that can be very specific for example, an individual data attribute, and it will give you a semantic definition of the attribute, and it will give you a syntax definition of the attribute. But there are also standards that are more process-based standards. So for example, when you look at GS1's approach to traceability standardization, that begins with business processes. It begins with identifying critical supply chain activities that you want to be able to track and trace, and then the critical data elements that you want to capture for each of those events in the supply chain. And so in that regard, you have a process-based framework that is driving the more detailed standards development process behind it. And if you've got organizations that are following exactly that same framework, then you've got a level of business process alignment as well. You're never going to necessarily align every single part of business processes, because that will be an incredible, probably impossible task across the world. But certainly the key activities that lead to business interaction as a result of a transactional process or a trade process can definitely be aligned, and there are already some standards that can help you with that. So hopefully that assists.
Thanks, Marcel, and sorry for putting you on the spot there. But it sounds like you had a good response prepared. Maria, do you want to also chime in on this one, especially if you have some advice or comments on where can industry turn for training and information on business process interoperability? Thoughts on that?
Thanks, Patrick. Well, certainly GS1 is one place that you can turn to, that we provide a lot of training and education, mainly around the integration of global standards into the processes, which will then give you that interoperability that you're looking for. Of course, there's all sorts of other places like the universities. You can find all number of courses that will help. But I would turn also to our solution providers, so the third-party solution provider community, and there's quite a number of those organisations who would be very helpful. And as Marcel rightly says, each business process, whilst you can name it the same, the process and how it's implemented in every organization can be vastly, vastly different. You know, what gives you that ability to be interoperable is if that process is underpinned by the same standards. So a process is a process until systems need to talk to each other. When they need to talk to each other, that's when you need the standards. That's when you need those standards to be able to talk to each other. So whilst you may not completely be able to standardize the process itself, its ability to be interoperable can be standardized by ensuring that you're using common standards to do that.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to jump in now to the final question, and this is a topic I'm very, very interested in seeing how it kind of develops. So Australia and Singapore have the digital economy agreement in place, as mentioned by Vanessa, and this is a groundbreaking free trade agreement, and I would say that Singapore and Australia are really at the forefront of the thinking here, how governments can collaborate also on very practical issues when it comes to digital trade standards. Oswald, I know you've been very, very positive and keen on this agreement coming into force. Would you like, since you're also based in Singapore and most of the other group is in Australia, would you like to give your perspective from ICC DSI on what's the potential of this this agreement when it's becoming implemented?
Thank you, Patrick, for that. Just to briefly touch on the previous conversation, what a lot of people don't realize is when you deploy standards, it's not just the data model, but there's a view on process models too, and what the processes should be. So again, adopt the standards. It will help with interoperability, but it will also help you get a sense of what good looks like from a process point of view. Anyway, on the digital economy agreements, it's a remarkable step into the right direction. So how do I explain this to some of my stakeholders? I go, there's local regulation, and in some countries, local regulation goes, yes, you can transition from a paper to electronic, but in some countries it doesn't. And trade agreements is a nice way of equalizing some of these playing fields for businesses as they engage between different jurisdictions. When you think about the Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, and again, especially for the business community on today's session, is it fundamentally gives us a foundation. It's two governments signing an agreement saying we're actually going to work together. We're going to solve identity. We're going to solve the ability for us to move data between our countries with limited friction. We're going to solve the challenges associated with having paper transfer between our countries. And so if you look at the agreement, it has something like 12 MOUs that is attached to it. And I think it has something like 10 different clauses around how to enable all of these. And one of the key things that I'm excited about is how do we mobilize the business community to leverage it? We've seen the governments do it. So we've seen, for example, the Australian and Singapore governments work together to try and do certificate of origin exchange between the two countries, using some of the principles in those agreements already to kind of show the world what is potentially possible. But this is where I would almost call on, for example, some of the great mining companies in Australia to say, well, let's take that a step further. Let's see that if we're trading, for example, into Asia, and we're trading into China or Japan, etc., and we're going through Singapore as a hub, how do we leverage that digital economy agreement to remove some of the frictions via Australia through the channel into China?
Thanks, Oswald. Hey, Randall, can I just ask you, I mean, I know you mentioned previously that FTAs are outside the scope of the work you are doing, but how do you expect this? There is an MOU on trade facilitation, for example, under the DEA. How do you expect this to impact the work that you are doing when they're talking about supporting the harmonization of customs procedures and data standards between Singapore and Australia? Because this must be something you need to take into consideration, right, as you progress with the work.
It is, but it is much broader than simply the trade elements. There's the elements that relate to the restrictions on transfer and location of data. There's commitments on e-invoicing and payments. The building business and consumer trust in international trade. These are all things that help to build confidence in being able to interoperate with another jurisdiction. And much of what we've heard, particularly from exporters, is the requirements in importing countries are often different to what they would experience in their various target markets. So this provides a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to develop thinking, and certificates of origin trial was mentioned, for us to actually test some of this thinking enabled by a set of interoperable and mutually recognised standards. And the agreement, I think, facilitates the broad concept of trade. And so I think for us, it provides a huge opportunity to have a country that we're able to interoperate with a common understanding, to test thinking and develop capability.
Thank you, Randall. That was my last question for the panel session. I would like to thank all the participants in the panel discussion: Vanessa, Randall, Oswald, Jesse, Maria, and as well as Maria Palazzolo, who opened the meeting. I'd like to thank you for joining. It's been a very interesting discussion. I appreciate it a lot, and I hope there will be a number of follow-up actions coming out of this session, even though I'm aware that many of us will go on a summer or a Christmas break in the next couple of weeks. If we can move to the next slide, I'd just like to also highlight that for those of you that are based in Australia, you are more than welcome to join the National GS1 Traceability Advisory Group. There is contact information on the next slide. If we can go to the next slide. And here you see some of the current members in the group. So with that, I would like to thank you all for joining this session, the last NGTAG open session of the year. And thank you for joining, and bye-bye.